Welcome to Detonation Point. I'm your host, Matt O'Neill. I was with the U.S. Secret Service for 25 years and retired as the Deputy Special Agent in charge of the Cyber Operations part of the Criminal Investigative Division. In Detonation Point, I'm going inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Welcome back, everybody, to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Our guest this week is Mike Olson. Mike was with the U.S. Secret Service for 25 years, Mike. Is that about right?
22.
22. Oh, you got out early. And Mike and I spent 4 years together on the Vice President's detail. But aside from being one of the best investigators that I've ever worked with and a mentor when we were on the Vice President's detail, one of the things that really struck me based on what's been in the news lately is Mike was in Minneapolis when we started our Global Investigative Operations Center for the Secret Service back in 2017. And I was calling around to the best investigators saying, how can I help? And the first person I called was Mike. And Mike said, boy, do I got a case for you. Mike, what was that case? Do you remember?
Boy, that one might have been the Mustafa investigation, which was a cell phone crew that they had about, 15 stores across the Twin Cities. They were basically facilitating the purchase with identity theft and then the purchase of stolen cell phones from street robberies and things like that. And they were networked into a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm guessing that was probably about the time you were starting up the job.
That's good memory. But then you said something else. You said, we're also working on something that would blow you away because it is so massive. And you started talking about programmatic fraud. And I did not have any idea what you're talking about. I remember saying, if you need any help, hopefully we can provide support. But you were the first person that ever told me about how bad programmatic fraud was, specifically in Minnesota. Can you walk the listeners through what programmatic fraud is and what was going on? What were you seeing all the way back in 2017?
So at that point in 2017, so our task force that we had here in Minnesota was comprised of some federal agencies, IRS, us, FBI would come on and off, depending on the case, and then a bunch of state investigators, and then depending on the program fraud, they would join the task force to help, get some of our support. But at that time, it was a lot of what we're seeing right now, the Somali fraud, specifically some of the daycare, CCAP, Child Care Assistance Program fraud was really starting to become a big thing, and that was one piece of it. But here in Minnesota, some of this stuff dates back to before I even came to Washington D.C. I remember, so there was another agent in the office. This would have been around maybe 2002, and we were starting to see where there was just people really taking advantage of some of these things. And I would say we probably didn't even know what the heck program fraud was at that point in time. But I'll never forget, we were sitting in the office together and his agent calls up one of the county, Department of Human Services numbers and was trying to find out information as to how somebody was committing some of these fraud schemes. And whoever he got on the phone was clearly just some phone operator who walked him through basically a question and answer that we realized we could commit a whole kinds of fraud just by having this conversation with this person, because they were effectively facilitating the conversation that would result in you getting more and more money. They're making it easy for you to figure it out. And I'm sure that it was kind of a customer service thing. But for example, he was like, what do you need to know from me? And she was like, well, if you live in this county or that county, in this county, you'll be entitled to, X amount. But if you live in this county, it's only this amount. He goes, oh, well, I live in such and such county. And so it would be the one that paid out the higher amount. Oh, okay, great. We get to a question maybe about children. How many children do you have? Well, is there a higher amount of money for more children? Well, yeah, for one child, you would get this. For 4 children, you would get that. Well, I have 4 children. So he was walking through their checklist of all this. And it's like, well, gosh, if we can do that just on a unannounced solicited call, imagine how that has grown over the years. So by the time I transferred back in 2009, after leaving DC, we were on the heels of the housing crisis, 07, 08. And we immediately got involved in a massive case where it was a hierarchy of individuals. It was clearly transnational organized crime components, but with people right down to local level that were runners. But they weren't just defrauding banks. Also then, as the investigation grew, or as we did search warrants, we'd find that, for example, we'd find a bunch of identities in the house, and we'd call up the state and find out all these identities were also being used for like Department of Economic Development fraud programs or schemes against that to make claims on unemployment for example. So it's been a pervasive problem for quite some time, but it continued to get exponentially worse and worse and worse over the years.
So going back to 2002 and 2009, was it organized crime? And if so, who was doing it?
Yeah. So, I mean, here in Minnesota in 2002, we had a massive case involving Nigerian organized crime. These guys were tied to other big cases around the globe that some Secret Service had, some other agencies had. And then by the time I came back in 2009, the case we got involved in right out of the bat was definitely Nigerian origin, West African type, our traditional historical West African fraud task forces. I mean, this was like a textbook model, group for that. But in Minnesota, we had a very large Liberian community as well. And so we quickly realized they were aspects of the organized crime elements within those communities were working hand in hand with each other. And then they would share infrastructure and resources or runners or mules and things like that to execute various schemes that they had expertise in.
So when did you first hear about specifically Somalis? Because that's been in the news. Was that in the early days as well?
Yes. So Minnesota's Somali community was I was a St. Paul police officer. I had a break in service from the Secret Service. I started in Chicago. Yep. I came back. I was a St. Paul cop from 98 to 2000. And the patrol district that I was in that period of time had a heavy Somali community, for example, on the Lower East Side of St. Paul. And there were pockets of the Somali community growing in other parts of St. Paul, but also in Minneapolis near the West Bank of the University of Minnesota, where a lot of what you see right now that's happening in the national news is video of ICE going into some of those areas specific to that community. But they were kind of new to the area back then, but they were entrenched. The communities, people moved where other people from their community lived together. It was the same with the Nigerians here in Minnesota, Liberians, and other ethnic groups that moved in. They tended to concentrate together like they do in other parts of the country. I didn't see as much of it involving them, if any, when I was first stationed here in the early 2000s after I came back to the Secret Service after St. Paul. But by the time we came back in 2009, they were all interconnected. It's a big area between Minneapolis and St. Paul, but the organized crime elements of the community here of the state are definitely interconnected. They work together, share information, all that kind of stuff. And so we definitely were seeing some Somali elements of organized crime involved in some of our cases that Nigerians and Liberians were a part of, to include a lot of bank insiders.
And that's going back 8-9 years ago.
I transferred back in 2009, and we immediately got involved. Well, yeah, the case we got involved in at that time, it ultimately became dubbed Operation Starburst. And I sent you a diagram of that case. That ultimately was a court exhibit right there of just the leadership that went to trial. So this was just an example to paint for the jury. And the reason I sent this to you is because it's public information now. Yeah. As you know, most cases plead out. You can't get this stuff out into the the open world here to discuss. But this one was great because it became a government exhibit, became public information. And it kind of helps tell a story, especially for a lot of people that don't understand transnational or organized crime fraud or program fraud and things like that. But just even within this is just a small example of some of the fraudsters. And the bank insiders alone there were Nigerian, Liberian, Somali, and from Ghana was another one. And the informants we had in this case had identified up to 35 bank insiders across the various communities. But as you know, we can't, as government agents, compel a bank to work an investigation with us. So we would get limited involvement. When we did get it, it was very good from some of the banks that helped us make these cases. But as everybody can understand, these private organizations or the banks don't want this kind of exposure or reputational hit to realize that there's a bank insider that's facilitating identity theft and fraud and things like that. But it was across the board. And the thing we tried to emphasize in our collaborative meetings was there's nobody immune from this in the Twin Cities right now. There's no bank that's immune. It's just a question of what surveillance systems you have in place and software that we can collaboratively work together to make a case. But a lot of them just wanted to get rid of the bank insider and it would move on. It was funny can we talk SARS briefly at a high level?
Yes. Yes, sir.
So what was interesting is, and by the way, I got to mention her name. We had one of the best criminal analysts for the Secret Service, Sandy Bredemus.
Sandy?
Yeah. And man, honestly, as an investigator, I always felt you just give me one Sandy, and then, we can go out and do this with our partners in law enforcement. We can make big cases with a really good, analyst. And that's why with what you were building in the JOC, it was so important, to build that kind of infrastructure for these types of cases. But she helped put a lot of this together, was always taking in the data, the interview reports, looking at the SARs and stuff. But she would pull SARs for us, and I would review some of those. It always struck me that I'd see that a bank insider that maybe we made the case on, could have been one of them pictured here. I would find all kinds of SARs from 2, 3, 4 different banks that they worked at where there was red flags that they were engaged in some type of fraudulent activity or facilitating money laundering or whatever it might be. But that bank just fired them for some procedural violation, chewing gum the wrong way out of on the left side of their mouth instead of the right side of their mouth. And the problem moved on to another bank. And it took us a while, but we eventually got a good chunk of the banking community in Minnesota to realize we got to work together on this. And you don't have to do this, but we need your cooperation if we're going to make a dent, go after the head of the snake, so to speak. And that's kind of what happened in this first case. And this one lasted from 2009 to, I think we did the search warrant on the top guy there, Julian Okiene. I think the search warrant was in 2012.
Can you walk the listeners through what a foot soldier, bank insider, a facilitator is? I think probably everybody would understand what a leader is, but kind of just give a quick summary is when you say foot soldier, what are they doing to help with this hierarchical structure?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically the foot soldiers were runners, recruits. That was another, also known as we used for them, lower level people that were recruited from various communities. So the manager facilitators, just there on that chart, you've got a couple Nigerian guys, Liberian guy, as an example there, that were entrenched in the community, definitely feared by a lot of both honest and culpable to fraud within some of these communities. But they would recruit those foot soldiers, so to speak. And this is just an example for the jury. This wasn't even all encompassing. I think we arrested something near 300 quote unquote foot soldiers or runners as part of this investigation to then work our way up, flip them into the next group and things like that. But there were people that, even at the worst, it was drug users, people that are down on their luck, needed money, so they were willing to put their face on the surveillance camera in the banks. They were the ones that went in, posed as Tammy Smith, stolen identity from somewhere else in the country, opened up bank accounts. And then the bank insiders would help the manager facilitators understand the know your customer rules. Man, we recovered in some search warrants, know your customer rules out of banks. So they would know, hey, we got to wait 6 months before we can activate an account, use it for fraud. The guy on the far right there, bank insider, he was reviewing bank customer information and deciding if like an elderly person wasn't actively looking at their accounts and stuff, that would be an account they would go after. And so then
takeover?
Yeah, account takeovers.
Okay.
I mean, these guys were doing everything, Matt, and not just fraud. Some of these guys were involved in human trafficking, you name it. It was completely fascinating. Mortgage fraud, HELOC. This branch of what we did, the first phase of this thing, 50 million was just what we proved up for trial for sentencing purposes. Julian got 27 years. And
wow.
Yeah, there was another guy that's not pictured on there that pled out at the last minute, but he got a significant amount too. But we estimated with the mortgage fraud that these guys were involved with prior to 2009, probably 150 million easily, most of it out of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis area, just that alone.
So going back to like what they're talking about today, obviously there's a massive problem going back a generation in the Twin Cities. Were you surprised at all when the news came out and everyone was shocked that all this program fraud was happening? And then also, what did the state know? I'm sure you had conversations with the state. Were you frustrated, having been retired for a couple of years, that nothing was done since you retired to try to tamp down on some of this fraud?
Yeah, I was heavily frustrated. Matter of fact, the fraud going on in the Somali community specifically was one of the last major components of fraud that I was working on with the Secret Service. And it was in part a major reason I decided to retire from the Secret Service, because it was like running on a treadmill. We were getting nowhere because ultimately nobody really wanted to do anything on any side of anywhere. There was mass frustration amongst agents and state officers and things.
So the U.S. Attorney's Office didn't want to prosecute?
It was limited. They prosecuted a few cases. We executed warrants on a big piece of this. I retired in 2018, so it would have been early 2018, maybe late 2017. We did a bunch of warrants on a bunch of child daycares across Twin Cities. But the hoops we needed to try to jump through were significant enough that it was almost like, is this worth the money the federal government has to spend to come in to help the state government to remediate this problem that they know about and could fix by flipping off the switch? And like some of our early meetings on our task force with some of the state investigators from some of the, like Department of Human Services and some of the other program areas behind closed doors with us, they were extremely frustrated. They said they know this is happening. The program areas of the government that are spending these tax dollars, they know this is happening. And it was only getting worse and worse and worse.
And that was 8 years ago, just to be clear. That was not like 6 months ago. You're talking 8 years ago that
Yes.
you guys were well aware that this was a problem, and so was the state.
Yes. Yes. And I don't know why all this is so complicated for people out there, but to me, life is really no more difficult than like Pavlov's dog. If you hang a bone in front of somebody and they realize if they ding the bell that they're going to get a bone, and maybe if they ding the bell twice, well, maybe now I get 2 bones. It's just a matter of time before it's going to get out of control. And in my opinion, it's effectively what's happened here, especially in the state of Minnesota over the years. Nothing got done about it. Nobody's held accountable. And somebody figured out they can ring a few more bells, and there's just more and more money that comes in as part of all this fraud. So no, am I surprised? Absolutely not. Am I surprised it all of a sudden is getting all the attention it is? That I'm surprised about. I think it's fantastic. My dollars are somewhere lost amongst all this fraud. So it's highly frustrating. You know, obviously federal dollars were commingled as far as these programs with state dollars. And I think 8 years ago, there was probably more, well, we don't want to believe this from certain entities, non-law enforcement entities in government, that doesn't look like we're picking on one group if we're going after this stuff specifically, that kind of thing.
So when you say non-law enforcement, are you saying like the entities that were handing out the money, they did not want to make it appear as if they were looking at one community that was doing the fraud, because then it would appear to be targeted?
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. Nobody wants to have an honest conversation these days, just in reality. I've always been fortunate to be able to stand by on these cases. We've only talked about a fraction of what went on between 2009 and 2018. We had informants from the communities that their own members of their community were being victimized by elements of the organized crime that exists to commit these crimes. And so we really had the ability to do good things by a lot of people by suppressing this stuff from going on, but nobody really understood that. So, but Minnesota's always been a quote unquote politically correct state. We've got to worry about that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think my observation from growing up here, living here, being a part of these massive cases for a good chunk of my adult life are that people felt like it was some sort of discrimination or something like that. And meanwhile, just like we know how human trafficking can work and things like that, there are a lot of victims that we don't hear their story if we're not willing to go and aggressively go after some of this fraud to get that organized crime element out of there. At some point here, some of these cases I'm telling you about, the drug cartels were involved in, behind the scenes, with some of the people involved in. So it's just unbelievable to me to see where it's gone and how much it grew.
So can you unpack that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear program fraud, first program fraud, meaning government programs, so programmatic fraud, government program frauds, they think, oh, well, there's just government dollars. Who's the real victim? It's Health and Human Services. It's this, it's that. But there's a human element to the victimization as well. So can you speak a little bit about who are the victims aside from these big, bureaucratic organizations that are just handing out other people's money?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the taxpayers are just right off the bat are massive victims. I mean, when I moved back here, when the current governor took over, we had I think it was a $16 billion or some X billion-dollar surplus. Now we're looking at the billions that have been disclosed that we've lost, and we're no longer running surpluses in this state and things like that. So certainly all of us taxpayers are victims of this. Federal taxpayers don't realize your federal tax dollars are commingled with some of this stuff that goes on at the state level. It could be affecting people in other states as well, especially if dollars aren't going into other programs in other states because they're going to a state like Minnesota instead of some other state that could benefit from this, but doesn't have the same amount of fraud problem maybe. And then certainly, like I said, if you were to go back to that chart I showed you at that quote unquote foot soldier level, a lot of people that we had on a lot of the different fraud schemes we worked didn't necessarily have significant criminal histories. They were members of the community. We interviewed some of these people who were like, I feel compelled to help with this fraud scheme just to simply tell this story because so-and-so at the manager facilitator level hired knows my family back in Nigeria or in Somalia, and I'm worried that they're going to harm them or do something like that. Take the cell phone case I mentioned, for example. The victims in that case are people that were being robbed, being violently beaten for their phones around the Twin Cities. That problem, at least temporarily, cleaned up here in the Twin Cities when we took that whole network of upper level fraudsters, leaders down. It suppressed it. And did it end forever? Nah, there was another case here recently after I retired, and somebody else picks it up, figures it out, and goes back. But if we don't go after that stuff at the higher level, we're just picking low-hanging fruit. And a lot of times that low-hanging fruit is also, I mean, some of these people are victims of other types of crimes. They're not the people that, should be going to jail and that, but and a lot of times they don't. They get probation, but now they got a criminal history, criminal record, and meanwhile, we're not going after the head of the snake.
Did you suspect in 2018 when you retired out of frustration that the fraud losses in your state were in the billions of dollars?
Honestly, being that I've never come close to ever thinking about personally having $1 billion in my life, I don't know that comprehended in my mind. Absolutely in the millions. So we were tracking part of our strategy before I left, and this has come out. There's been different people here locally that have been interviewed that have kind of talked about this or exposed it. But one of the things the Somali community was doing was they would have couriers, money couriers, because they operated on a Hawala system. And so sometimes they weren't using traditional banking methods to launder money or to get proceeds back over to Somalia or wherever. So in the Hawala stuff, you can't get at because you have to be able to do a search warrant on this end of a Hawala door, I think, if I remember right, that they were called, that manages the Hawala. And then you would ideally have to get it on the other end. Well, to get it on the other end means either counterterrorism or military involvement in order to try to, connect the two dots of who's receiving the money. But one of the things we learned at the tail end before I retired on this case was there were money couriers that were literally couriering cash out of the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport in suitcases, and they were declaring it. And usually it was about $1 million a shot. So we would get calls. We integrated ourselves with the whole process with airport, with DHS, with the TSA, to get notified when these shipments would go out. So we were trying to identify who the money couriers were. So ultimately we felt if we could follow the money couriers and see which daycares they're going to and then figure out where they're picking up the cash or all of the other spin-off elements that benefited from this program fraud, transportation stuff, food vendors that are supposedly supplying the food to 1 million kids that are coming through these programs, but they really aren't. So there's a lot more than just the daycares themselves that participate in making the scheme look legit. But just based off that money movement alone in the suitcases, it was millions. And so, yeah, we knew it was big and it was only getting worse. But I don't know back in 2018 that I would have comprehended that someday I'd hear it being talked about in the billions upon billions, especially when from my perspective now, 7 years later, going on 8, that when you have the state investigators who knew that this stuff could be shut off easily, how is it 8 years later we still have not shut it off?
How do you shut it off?
Well, I think that gets back into the who ultimately wants to take responsibility and point fingers at each other to say, well, are you going to say that a majority of the daycare stuff in the Somali community is fraud, but what if it isn't? And we don't have hard facts. Nobody, I don't think, wanted to own that decision. Is just my perspective, or there's something more nefarious to it. I mean, that somebody, whoever that is, didn't want to shut it off for whatever reasons. And because there's so much malfeasance associated with it at this point, it's just unbelievable. And taxpayers should just be outraged. All taxpayers.
Do you think it's malfeasance or nonfeasance? Meaning, we always say, like, one of the problems is, how is the person that's doling out the money take whoever's responsible for that person who made that phone call that you were describing earlier? They're not rated on how much fraud they're saving. There's not any metric to kind of give them any sort of like credit for stopping. We live in a society of pay and chase, get the money out, law enforcement. We know that doesn't work, especially now when money's moving faster than ever. It might have worked moderately well in the 70s and 80s where it was all traditional finance and stuff like that. But now, I mean, forget about it. It is a complete joke. So do you think that the way you say it, it makes me think that that the people that were running these organizations were well aware that a massive amount of fraud was taking place, but they chose not to look into it because for whatever reason that we don't know.
So your ultimate comparison there was nonfeasance versus malfeasance. And I think certainly the U.S. Attorney's Office now here, and I don't know how much is being talked about Minnesota specifically on a national level, but they definitely have picked up the ball recently and have sunk their claws into what's going on. And I'm hoping maybe we hear from some of those cases as to, in terms of following the money, can we see, have they flipped anybody that says, well, here's who I was paying off, that kind of thing? Because to your question, if there's not that, or somebody didn't make that as part of the case of the investigation in terms of actually going after the head of the snake, whatever that head of the snake is, then it's a really, really horrible case of nonfeasance. And it's just literally somebody, doing this. I thought they were going to shut it down, or I thought they were going to, turn it off, or whatever the case may be. But give you an idea, when we first got involved in aspects of this, and again, some of it had been going on, state investigators would tell us, well, a person that manages the program may go out and do a spot check at the daycare, for example. What I recall was a lot of times they would call up the daycare owner and say, hey, next Tuesday at 2 p.m., we're going to come walking through your facility to do an inspection and do our normal audit. Well, what we learned from our investigation of our piece of it is what these daycare owners would do then is get on the phone with all their co-conspirators and say, hey, I need 25 kids at my location next week, so that when the auditors come through, it looks like we've got a full daycare running here. They were paying.
And how long ago was this? Was this in 2018?
I retired summer of 2018, so this would have been 2017 into 2018. Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But my recollection was from the state investigators that were frustrated. There were a few examples where they would do random inspections, or they would take a look at from outside, is there anybody going in and out of these daycares, things like that? And the answer was no. Well, our standards then are controls, if you will, for something like this, when there's this much fraud potential, should then just be that much more aggressive in order to ensure that we're holding a higher standard here to the program. For example, what we had to do in the Secret Service, we ended up bringing in our TSD section to put cameras up on a lot of these daycares, and they wanted the cameras up and running for you had to have them up for at least 30 days, ideally 60 to 90 days. And then you have to have the manpower to be able to go through, watch the video, show that there's no kids coming in and out. There's no cars showing up. Once in a while, we heard that what they would do is they would hire some of the mothers, the quote unquote mothers, to come in and falsely sign the books to say that they dropped off their kid, but there's no kid that was with them. So they're just coming in to check all the boxes that need to be done in order to satisfy the state's checklist of what appears that they're legit. A mother came in and signed this log. Well, again, back to the whole comment about the low-hanging fruit or the foot soldier. Are we going to go after that mom that's been recruited or pressured from organized crime in their community to say, well, yeah, I falsified a state record saying my kid went there and they didn't? It would take decades to make a case that way. And so obviously that they're hopefully starting to make the cases now, but that was kind of the standard was so high, what we needed to do to prove it. And it becomes a big suck on the resources, so to speak, especially in the Secret Service with protection mission, to be able to get enough people to review all this video and things like that.
Well, good, bad, or indifferent, I have heard from several folks still in government that one of the things that they like about working today is that when the taskers are going down to the law enforcement, whether it's HSI, who sent like 2,000 people into the Twin Cities, the same thing's coming down to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Like, this is a priority. You investigate it. You prosecute it. We never had that. In my time, like, none of the stuff that we really worked had that dual sort of like from up on high, you're going to go do this and you're going to smash it into a million pieces. So from that perspective, you just wonder if that's one of the reasons why, as you said, the U.S. Attorney's Office is all of a sudden interested. They don't have a choice. But you said something earlier, right before we joined, that I thought was really interesting, because you were so frustrated that you said that you wanted to take some really interesting as a forfeiture action to try to stop it. Can you kind of tell the listeners which by the way, I love the idea and where your head was. Tell the listeners what you were thinking and who said no.
Yeah. So obviously, as you know, it's another aspect, at least just speaking from the Secret Service, for an agent to understand the tool and the power of asset, seizure and forfeiture, and using that as a tool to disrupt or go after some of this fraud or organized crime. And we had done a lot of that leading up to this particular case. And by the time we were into it, and what I was seeing is, and then listening to from the state, I'm like, well, man, I'm pretty sure I could put it together a pretty gosh darn good probable cause statement here for seizure and forfeiture of the state funds for the child care assistance program because of the commingling of federal dollars, so there'd be the federal jurisdiction, and at least make a statement with that this won't be tolerated. This needs to be looked at. The whole thing with, petition for remission or mitigation concepts that the state's got to come back and show that, no, we've got good things in place, good controls. It would have been a great way to maybe force that issue. But the initial response I got from everybody from Secret Service to U.S. Attorney's Office was, whoa, no, we're not.
That wouldn't have been me.
Seizing state funds. We don't want to be a part of that.
I would have been on a flight to Minnesota and say, let's do it, baby. Let's go.
And I know
We're
you would have
taking
been
it down.
behind. I know you would have been behind it. And it's just, I wished if I would have had a crystal ball and then the fact that just based on my personal circumstances with why I decided to retire, I hit my minimum, and I just decided I didn't want to fight it. I went to Nitro late in my career, and I kind of wanted to move on. And I'm like, I didn't want to make waves on it. But if I would have had a crystal ball to see where we're sitting now, I absolutely would have gone out in a blaze of glory trying to make that happen one way or the other.
Which is fascinating to me. So 8 years ago, as I said in the beginning, you're on the Mount Rushmore of criminal investigators in the Secret Service in the last, in this century, in the last 25 years. And you thought you had probable cause to go in and seize the funds related to all of this fraud that they're talking about today 8 years ago. And yet it was the same. What are you doing? Because it was thinking outside the box. Yeah. And you do wonder, like, hindsight's 2020, what would have happened if it was a different agency, obviously, in the service back in those days, to a degree, to a large degree. And then also, that's the problem that I have is, while I love these conversations about fraud, people don't talk about it as much as they should, because it's not just Minnesota. Do you think that this is taking place nationwide and it's organized crime, but it might not be Somalis? It could be Russians. It could be whatever the group is. Or do you think this is just localized in Minnesota?
No, it's nationally, without question. I can tell you that just early on from that chart you displayed on Operation Starburst. I mean, that was a perfect example of the globalization of that, but definitely on a national level. The matter of fact, just on the Somali stuff, we were seeing a lot of connections in some of the records we obtained to, I believe it was Seattle, Washington, might have been Ohio, parts of Tennessee, and same with the earlier cases with some of the Nigerian organized crime, Liberian organized crime. Like North Carolina has a big Liberian community that was connected to the Minneapolis community. So and we would see that, and it was fascinating, Matt. It was an eye opener. I loved the last 9 years of my career. It made my time working in the SCIF and the Special Counterfeit Operations Program at headquarters. That was an experience, but my last 9 years was just eye-opening in terms of, organized crime, transnational global fraud, how small the world really is. And it was great to see that you were able to spin up the JIOC and get that going, because it was so much needed with some of the things that the Secret Service saw as part of our, areas of expertise and fraud and things like that.
One of the things that you mentioned about Sandy Bredemus is she was a wonderful analyst, probably, the top analyst that we had. But it really speaks to, I think, the mission of the U.S. Secret Service, and that we are good at fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, wire fraud, computer fraud, access device fraud, you name it, it's fraud. And one of the things that concerns me about this sort of topic of conversation as it relates to, the Secret Service should just do protection, and they should only do investigations focused on protection. The two things that bother me is, one, we're really goddamn good at what you were doing. And two, we have a whole bunch of analysts that do the work. So when you have a really good analyst group that is doing it, the amount of manpower for agents is very, very low. And so name another agency that's large enough to tackle this problem that will make it a priority? It's, HSI is a wonderful organization, but they're getting stretched in a million different directions. It's a priority today, but tomorrow a different priority is going to come. This has always been our priority. It's never the FBI's priority. I love the FBI. My wife gets a pension check once a month from them. Love it. But it's never a priority for them, and it never will be a priority for them. Where do you stand on where we are currently with our former agency, and what would you like to see moving forward?
So I understand those agents, former agents and current agents that maybe, I mean, be careful how I say this because I'm not trying to to offend anybody, but are not big criminal investigators. I get it, especially why initially you think, oh, we should just be doing protection. However, I can tell you from a majority of my career, the biggest reason everybody left early or retired early was not because of investigations. It was because of the protective mission and the burnout involved with that. And so that's to me, that's a starting point right then and there. I think that Secret Service needs to rework itself around our traditional founding and mission of Treasury and, obviously the evolution into Homeland Security, but money is the root. The love of money is the root of all evil, right? And so a lot of these organizations that are threats to our protective mission are potentially in effect funded somewhere down the chain by the very groups that the Secret Service investigates for fraud or has the potential to. I think it's important to stay involved in that to make sure that pressure stays on those funding channels. I mean, we had skimmer cases in Minnesota where these Romanian skimmers, crews were admitting to using the drug cartel networks to smuggle in, and I'm talking like the bank ATM skimmers, where they're manufactured overseas. Then how do they get them into the country? Well, they get them into the country through the drug cartel networks, smuggling networks. So there's this cross use of all this experience and infrastructure from these various entities. And to your point, yes, Secret Service had a very good way of working this. We had a lot of flexibility. You've worked with the IRS. No offense to IRS. I mean, another awesome partner, but man, to get a case open or to get, to look at the tax records of a money launderer or whatever, you know what it's like. It's like pulling teeth, and they have to go through Maine Justice and all these things to get approvals. Secret Service gave us actually a lot of leeway and a lot of flexibility as a criminal investigator to go after these cases. More importantly, what was awesome, and it goes right hand in hand with the protective mission, is our ability to build these collaborative networks of both private sector and public sector to work these types of cases. Sandy was awesome, but I would have never traded Sandy or the other Sandys that are out there in Secret Service. The next element that I wouldn't trade is all of our other partners in all these other agencies. And I know you know that I'm preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
But those are the same entities that make us great protection agents, and the ability to go out there and do advances is because of that ability to build relationships like that. And if you did it right, you would have that whole network of your task force or whatever that can maintain a case, do that. So if you had to go do protection, you could go and do it. But I personally don't think the Secret Service would survive long term if they did away with their investigative mission. I absolutely think there would be burnout. They would shut down the mission. The protective mission would go to another agency or the military or whatever, but they would lose it, and the Secret Service would cease to exist if they gave up their investigative mission.
I would not have lasted. You would not have lasted because for the burnout, protection is boring, I think. I mean, 99% of it is standing around doing nothing. And when you have an active mind, you remember how much trouble I used to get in on VP because I had nothing to do. I saw Director Murray a couple weeks ago, and he was still laughing about and I totally forgot about this, the letter I wrote complaining about how the VP couldn't use the White House mess. Do you remember that? And I wrote like a manifesto about how we're being discriminated against. And he's like, that was one of the funniest things I ever read. Like, I totally forgot. And some of the shenanigans we got into because it's boring and it is not sustainable for family and for all that other stuff. And also, if you're going to do investigations and you're only investigating threats, you have to understand how the internet works. You have to understand how money moves. And if you're only doing it on threats, you're not going to be good at what you do because the volume play isn't there. It's 160 years of tradition, and you have to know what you're doing. And you just can't be calling other agencies to do your job for you. If you don't understand how to follow a lead on the internet because you don't work the cyber criminal cases, you're done. And you can't just do that. It's just not possible, at least in my view. But yeah, so that's why it's interesting to me. What you're telling me, what I get out of this is Secret Service is working these cases going back 20 something years. This is now a hot topic. And going back 8 years ago, this was going on, and so much so that it helped lead to you retiring, and then also thinking it was so bad that you could literally seize the funds of agencies, and nothing happened. And you mentioned all of the investigators that you worked with. Like, this was a known problem, and it just wasn't dealt with. So it's interesting because I just hope it's not a cheap political win to say, oh, well, we're just going to go after them because it's a blue state and it's your governor. And obviously he's like a lightning rod. And what I'm hopeful for is, with this administration being so powerful right now, that now is a really good time to create sort of like a national leader. We have somebody that's in charge of intelligence in the ODNI. We have somebody in charge of cyber. We have somebody in charge of drugs. We need to put somebody in charge of scams and fraud, because these people are stealing generational wealth from Americans and billions of dollars from the taxpayer. And we have no unified strategy. And that strategy can't become from DOJ, because you need to have somebody at a higher level sitting at the White House saying, we need to focus on this, because therefore that brings dollars to it. And you also have to, tell me what you think about this, create basically like a national center for missing and exploited children, like a NCMEC model for scams and fraud, because therefore now you can get private sector to share information with it. They're never going to share information directly. Meta's not going to share it directly. At post-Snowden world, that's not going to happen. But you need to have something, because the remedy for the Somali fraud is the remedy for pig butchering in many respects. Money mules. Go after money mules, go after those, whether it's the witting money mules going after the back insiders, follow the money, but also take down the infrastructure. Do you agree?
Oh, 1,000%, Matt. I mean, the one thing that I learned that I sit now and see what's going on nationally and globally is right here in Minnesota, which is, we always joked here in Minnesota, we're the last to see whatever happens on the East Coast, West Coast, eventually it'll happen in Minnesota. Saw it in terms of crime trends, emerging trends that would happen with fraud or just, street crime type stuff. But the one thing that I'll stand by and I'll defend to this day, anybody wants to go toe to toe on explain why, is we basically saw in the cases we worked right here in the heartland of Minnesota, infiltration at all levels related to fraud, crime. So we had bank insiders. I mean, barely scratched the surface for you, Matt. We had people in mortgage companies, title companies, police officers that were connected to the community, politicians that were rumored by these informants that we were building stuff on. It just got to be, at a certain point, you had to cut it off. Luckily, we cut it off where we made it to very high levels and we did some very, very good things. But what, looking back now, to me, is so scary is I haven't seen any other big cases like that made here in Minnesota until recently with the Somali daycare fraud stuff. But what people need to understand is organized crime, whether it's transnational organized crime, biker gangs, drug cartels, whatever, they get their talons inside of certain communities and certain things, and then only become stronger and stronger if nobody's going after them. And eventually, through organized crime, you need people in high places to help facilitate or make things happen or clear the path and things like that. So to your point, absolutely, there should be something at that higher level, like an ODNI that looks at that, but then ensuring that those people are communicating with each other, with the other group, because there is overlap. I have described it ad nauseum in all of my public talks I give since then, both to law enforcement or to the private sector, to elderly groups or church groups, is I describe it like the Olympic rings. Hopefully I don't get sued for saying that, because I don't know if it's trademarked or something.
Copyright. Yeah.
But that's how I describe it, is you have drug trafficking organizations overlapped with transnational fraud groups, overlapped with drug cartel, whatever. But not only that, but they overlap on criminal activity too, illicit activity. So like I said, right down to the local level, some of the guys we had doing the fraud are also involved in human trafficking. And so if you want to go, skin a cat however many ways, there are ways that if you bring all that together, sometimes working cases, fraud cases, is one of the best ways you can do it, because why? There's a document trail, as you know. Whereas some of these other cases, the human crimes, it might be harder because you have to wait for somebody to get killed before you can make a homicide case or whatever. I got a buddy who worked, former Secret Service, worked some of the cases in Minnesota with us. He spun off another one that we didn't talk about. He's now with ATF, and he's told me he's made a lot of cases in ATF on their crews that are involved in gun violations. They've actually made fraud cases, but then ultimately, because of the fraud case, getting them a warrant that got into the house or whatever, then they recover the guns, and they've made it either a multi-offense case on them, or whatever's going to put them away the longest. And so absolutely, I agree with you.
So one of the things that when you're talking to former Secret Service agents, the passion still comes through. And so I think you and I would go back tomorrow if the pay was better, but also like, cause you love it and I love it. But I'm going to switch gears on you for a minute. The person that I think exemplifies the agency probably better than anybody I know, that it was a friend of yours as well. Rodney Wellman passed away 5 years ago. And I share a picture for those of you guys that I don't have the picture, Mike, I looked for it. There is a picture of me and Mike and Rodney Wellman. We were going back so Rodney here is fifth on the right. This is them getting an award for a big case that they were, because Rodney was also a bloodhound. And Rodney would release the hounds. But there was a fun time where you and me and Rodney were in the transportation section, and we had to go shoot monthly. And we're walking past the White House, and I made some tourists take pictures of us. And Rodney's face got so red, because remember they used to call him tomato head, because his face would just get so red and embarrassed. But everybody I talked to said Rodney was my best friend. Rodney had like a million best friends. I just don't know if he knew it. Not only did he pass away, but he passed away 5 years ago. And then you had that great Steelers game. Did you ever go to the Steelers games with the crew?
Yeah, that was some of my best memories. I don't know if we should be admitting to this, but yeah, I mean, him bringing us up there into his hood, showing us a good time. There may or may not have been a smuggling or two of a can of beer.
Iron City Light.
Yeah, and just fantastic memories. And I don't remember which year it was, but I think one of the years we did a doubleheader where we did a Steelers, and then we went and watched the Pittsburgh Penguins play some ice hockey up there at the same time too. It was always a blast. I'm technically a Vikings fan, usually at the start of the season. Usually by the end of the season, I'm not year after year. But I got to say, on this 5-year anniversary, I was thinking about it the other day. I like the Packers too, being from the Midwest here. A couple of my kids are Packers fans. But I got to say, this year, I'm going to be rooting for the Steelers. I'm excited to watch the game tonight, be thinking of Rodney during that. And, you're right about Rodney being like everybody's best friend. We had an awesome crew, obviously, on the vice president's detail, the transportation section. And after I left vice president's detail, I went to headquarters, was in the special counterfeit operations program. I thank Mike D'Ambrosia for steering me in that direction. It was an awesome experience. Wish we could talk about some of the stuff we were exposed to in there. But I was so excited when Rodney got transferred over there and he was in there with me, because we're working in a skiff. No phones, no windows, no nothing. So you're in it's a little bit larger than the shadow box working in the skiff.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's gotten bigger since, but it was just great having him in there. And even in there, we got involved in some cool stuff, and he helped just with some of the people he knew in our agency that made sure we got connected with some of the right supervisory personnel to make some things happen that were important to this nation. It was cool to be a part of, and that's. After that, I transferred back to Minnesota, but that's the memory I have of Rodney, is working in those last couple years there in the skiff, and it was a blast, just like it was on the vice president's detail. And he's missed all the time, every day.
Yeah, I think about him every day, and we used to talk shop at least a couple times a week, and always talk casework when he was in Erie or in Los Angeles, or when he became the ASAC and SAC of Phoenix, about the cases, and he was really determined to have the next generation of agents. And even when he got sick and he wanted to run that ridiculous 100-mile race, like, I don't want to run a half mile. And this dude with stage 4 lung cancer sets out to run a 100-mile race in the middle of the desert. Like, he was built different. So many other things that he did when we were in transportation section, and we were in, I think you were there too, in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and we were racing. And the SAC of the detail was like, what intelligence do you guys have to make you drive the way you do? And it was nuts. We had such a great crew, but what a wonderful guy. Just, he defines the service. I describe it to people where, like, you and I have known each other for 23 years. I haven't seen you in person in 3 years, right? But if 10 years from now we saw each other, it would have been like it was back in 2006, right? And that's the agency. Yeah. And I don't know many other agencies that are like that. You have that esprit de corps, that camaraderie that is like nowhere else. And nobody defined that better than Rodney. Nobody cared about the agency better than Rodney. The biggest mistake I ever made was talking to Rodney. I was in New Hampshire at the time, and we just picked up Donald Trump. This was in like November of 2015. And Rodney was assigned to him as one of the shift leaders. And Rodney was like, because to explain to the listeners, right, that's 3 weeks out, 3 weeks home, 3 weeks out, 3 weeks home, indefinitely. And I said to him, I remember exactly where I was. And I said, don't worry, he's going to be out in 2 weeks. You're going to be back in because he was in Los Angeles. You're going to be back in 2 weeks. I couldn't have been more wrong. And he let me know that up until the very last day. He's like, dude, you're a because I would predict stuff like Eagles, football. And he's like, you are the worst prognosticator I've ever met in my life. Do you remember when you did that? So, Rodney was the best. In my phone, I have one voicemail that I've saved, and it was Rodney from back in 2020. Just a wonderful guy. Is there any other sort of memories, anything?
Yeah.
When you worked with him for those 2 years, what else you got on him?
Yeah, well, first of all, like the way you describe Rodney made me probably a better agent like late in my career because of just what you described. Is he was very confident. He spoke truth, always spoke truth to power. And there was something about that was infectious. And so like even just my time spending with him in the skiff, seeing some of the things we had to do and the people we had to interact with, it gave me a lot more confidence for the last, third of my career going back to Minnesota. But my last assignment was actually when you said Trump, it reminded me, I got to work with Rodney in a protective intelligence capacity during one of the Trump 3-week cycles or whatever out in Bedminster. And that was why I think while he might have been SAC of Phoenix Center, he was ASAC maybe down there. That was, I think, the last time I saw him in person. And it was awesome. It was like you just described it when you haven't seen somebody for a long time or whatever. We got back together and he was a boss. He didn't treat me like a boss. We just did our job. We did our function there for that. Had a good time. And it was awesome. He was just a real guy. And then the cool thing about him is he wasn't afraid to speak that truth because he was always doing it for the right reason. Sometimes it was just what people didn't want to hear, but they needed to hear it. And he was just a very confident individual. He was an inspiration, still is. I mean, he's one of the people in our whole career that I'll never forget, so.
I remember when we were in the transportation section and it was late at night and the cars were okay. We're like, do we need to wash them? Rodney was always the guy like, nope, we got to do it. We got to do it. And like, it was always holding everyone to a higher standard. And I'll always appreciate that. I think about him every day when I don't want to exercise. And I'm like, that sumbitch was out running like when he shouldn't have been. Like he would expect that. And I know he would bust my balls if I didn't. And so that is just something that will keep with us forever. And I did text his daughter after the Steelers win and said, he still wants Tomlin fired. I don't care. They can win the Super Bowl. Somewhere he is going, the guy needs to go. And then with Aaron Rodgers has his quarterback, I'd give anything just to spend 5 minutes just hearing what he's got to say about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No question. Yeah, no, he continues to live. Despite where he's at now, which is probably better places anyway, but he continues to live because he had real impact on people, real positive impact, especially for those that are smart enough or were good enough investigators to realize the impact he had on them. I would love someday to hear from some of the guys he supervised, because I'm sure you'd hear like he's one of the top bosses in people's minds with what he did.
Has to be. I spent a fair amount of time out there when he was in Phoenix because they were working big cases and we were out to support. And he definitely, he created some really good agents. A lot of them, unfortunately, left the agency because of the protection, but I know that where they are and they're kicking ass. So, and it was because of him.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
Well, Mike Olson, thank you so much for your time, bud. It was great catching up to you. Looking forward to continuing our friendship and chatting on a regular basis, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for talking about Hot Rod. It was great to walk down memory lane there for him. So
absolutely. He's the best. All right. Thank you, listeners, for listening to Detonation Point presented by Elastio, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.